Senna had worked in the palace for 3 years, and in that time, she had learned every corner of it, without ever seeing a single wall. She knew the kitchen by the sound of copper pots settling on stone shelves. She knew the long corridor to the east wing, by the way cold air pushed through a crack beneath the third window. She knew the tea chamber by smell, dried flowers hanging near the entrance, cedar wood on the shelves, and the faint metallic whisper of polished trays that had never once been set down carelessly. She was blind. She had been since she was 11 years old, but she had never once let that slow her hands. This particular morning began like every other. She rose before the palace did, dressed herself in her gray servant's uniform without help, and made her way to the kitchen to begin the morning preparations. The head attendant, a stout woman named Marin, usually gave her instructions before the first bell, but Marin was sick today. A young kitchen boy told Senna this, with the kind of nervous energy that suggested something bigger was attached to it. "The king's afternoon tea," the boy said. Marin was supposed to serve it herself today, special instructions and everything, but now. "I'll do it," Senna said. The boy hesitated. "It's the king." "I know who it is," she said simply. She had never served King Kalen directly. She had been near him, close enough to sense the weight of a room changing when he entered it, close enough to hear the way other servants held their breath. But she had never stood before him alone, never poured for him specifically. The thought did not frighten her. She was careful with everything she touched. A king's cup was no different from anyone else's, except perhaps heavier. She went to the pantry to gather the blend Marin would have used. But the cabinet where the palace teas were stored was locked, and the key sat somewhere on Marin's person, presumably in the attendants' quarters 2 floors up. Senna considered her options for a moment, standing in the quiet of the pantry, with her fingers resting on the wooden cabinet door. Then she reached into the small cloth pouch she always kept tied at her waist. She had carried it for 12 years. It was worn at the edges, the fabric softened to something almost like skin. Inside were the last of her mother's tea herbs, blackthorn bark, dried river mint, scorched cardamom, and a small sealed twist of wild clover honey to stir in before steeping. Her mother had grown most of it herself, in a garden beside their house in a village called Veyrath, on the northern edge of the kingdom. The recipe was old, passed down through her mother's family for generations, and it smelled like every safe morning Senna had ever known. She did not use it often. She was afraid of running out. But today, she reached in carefully, measured a small portion by feel, and began to prepare the king's tea. She carried the tray to his study without incident. She counted the steps as she always did, 14 from the staircase landing, then a slight turn left, then 7 more. She knocked once, was told to enter, and she did. The room was warmer than the corridor. A fire was going somewhere to her left, and the air near the windows tasted of cold glass and afternoon light. She heard breathing, slow, deliberate, the kind that belonged to someone accustomed to controlling every small thing about himself. "Your tea, Your Majesty," she said. Her voice did not shake. She moved to the table she knew was beside his desk. She had mapped this room mentally from conversations with other servants, and set the tray down carefully. She located the cup by touch, positioned the pot, and began to pour. He said nothing. He watched her. She could feel that, the particular quality of attention that presses against a person from across a room. But she was used to being watched with curiosity. Blindness made people stare. She had long ago stopped caring. She poured slowly. The steam rose. And then she stopped breathing. It was the smell, not just the tea, though the tea was part of it, the blackthorn and mint, and the faint sweetness of the honey. It was what the steam carried when it rose into this particular room, mixed with the air that was already here. There was something underneath it, something that had nothing to do with the herbs in her pouch. It was a scent that was already in the room before she arrived, something that belonged to the man sitting quietly a few feet away from her. Cold river water, dark soil after rain, blackthorn and something mineral, like the inside of a stone well. Senna had grown up next to that smell. She had not encountered it since she was 11 years old, standing outside her burning village, listening to it fall. Her hand remained perfectly still on the pot. She had trained it to be still. But inside, something she had kept carefully folded for 12 years had just come completely undone. She set the pot down. She straightened. And then, Because she had never been the kind of person who could hold a true thing inside her mouth and pretend it was nothing, she spoke. "Forgive me, Your Majesty," she said quietly. "The tea I prepared today, it is not a palace blend. I used my own supply. I apologize if that was not appropriate." A pause. "Why did you use your own supply?" "The pantry was locked. I did not want to disturb Marin while she was ill." Another silence, brief and unreadable. "What is in it?" "Blackthorn bark, river mint, cardamom, wild clover honey." She paused for just a moment before adding, "It is a recipe from Veyrath, a village in the north." The quality of the silence changed. She felt it the way she felt everything she could not see. Through what the air did, through what sounds disappeared, through the way a person's breathing shifts when something unexpected reaches them. The king's breath did not stop, but it changed, just slightly, just enough. "It is a very old recipe," she continued, still calm, still careful. "My mother made it every morning. She learned it from her mother. They were from Veyrath, on the East Road." She heard him set something down on the desk. She thought it might have been a pen. "You grew up there," he said. It was not quite a question. "Yes," she said. "Until I was 11. Until the conflict," he said. "Yes." The room was very quiet now. The fire shifted and settled. Somewhere far below, the palace moved on with its day, completely unaware that anything unusual was happening in this room. Senna waited. She was good at waiting. It was one of the things blindness had given her, a genuine patience with silence, an understanding that not everything needed to be filled. When the king spoke again, his voice was lower than it had been before. Not softer exactly, more careful. "The East Road," he said. "The healer's house was on the East Road." Senna's chest tightened very quietly. "Yes, my mother was the healer." Another pause. Long enough that she counted it. 4 full breaths. 5. "She brought tea to my mother once," he said slowly. "When my youngest sister was born, she came in the early morning before anyone was awake. She brought it in a blue bowl." Senna remembered the blue bowl. It had sat on the shelf above the hearth. Her mother had loved it because the handle was shaped like a river reed. She had carried it to neighbors for years, whenever there was a new child or an illness, or a grief that needed something warm to sit beside it. Her throat tightened, but she did not let her voice show it. "That was her," Senna said. "That was my mother." She heard him stand, not quickly, not dramatically. He simply rose from his chair, the way a person does when they realize that sitting no longer feels right for the conversation they are having. He was from Veyrath. She had not known, had never thought to wonder about the Alpha King's origin, because kings did not come from villages like Veyrath. Kings came from palaces and bloodlines and centuries of careful arrangement. They did not come from mill families on the northern edge of the kingdom, from small homes with wood fires and river clay on the walls, and a healer 2 doors down who made tea in a blue bowl. But the scent did not lie. She had been reading the world through scent her entire life. She knew what she knew. "You were there," she said gently, "before all of this." He did not answer immediately, and yet his silence confirmed it more clearly than words would have. It was the silence of someone who had stopped pretending for just a moment, without meaning to, because they had been caught off guard by something they had not expected to feel. "I was 14, he said finally, "when it happened." She nodded once, slowly. "I was 11. They stood in the same room and let that rest between them for a moment. The simple, enormous fact that they had both come from the same half-mile of earth, from the same cold northern air, from the same village that no longer existed anywhere except in their bodies. "May I sit?" Senna asked. She felt the slight pause that followed, the pause of a king recognizing that no servant had ever asked him that before, in this room, in this direct and unceremonious way. And then he said yes. She found the chair nearest to her by feel and sat down. She kept her hands folded in her lap. She was not nervous. She was something else entirely, something she did not have a word for, a feeling of standing at the edge of a door that had been sealed for 12 years and finding it unexpectedly open. They talked. Not as king and servant, not with the careful distance that the palace required between people of different rank. They talked as 2 people who had survived the same thing, which is one of the few situations in life that dissolves almost every other difference between people. He told her, slowly, without decoration, that he had not been born to the royal bloodline, that after Veyrath, he had been found by a distant branch of the royal family, that his alpha status had been recognized and then shaped into something useful, that he had been given a new name and a new history, and eventually a crown, that in exchange for all of it, he had agreed, quietly and without being directly told to, never to speak of where he came from. He had kept that agreement for 16 years. She told him about her mother, about the years after Veyrath, moving from one household to the next, learning to navigate the world without sight, in cities that were not built for it, eventually finding her way to the palace, through a connection a kind woman had made on her behalf. She told him that she still had the tea herbs because she had never been able to throw them away, that she measured how much was left every time she opened the pouch, that she had been rationing it for years without quite admitting to herself why. "I thought," she said simply, "that when it was gone, it would really be gone. Everything. All of it." He was quiet for a moment, then he said, "I understand that." And she believed him, because she had learned long ago that the truest things people say are almost always the shortest ones. The afternoon moved. Somewhere in the palace a bell rang, and then another, marking the hours. Neither of them moved to end the conversation. It ended on its own, the way real conversations do, not because anyone decided to stop, but because everything that needed to be said had been said, and what was left was simply the comfortable, slightly stunned silence of two people who had just discovered something they had not been looking for. When Senna finally rose to collect the tray, the tea was long cold. She did not apologize for it. "Leave the cup," the king said quietly. She paused. "The tea. You can take the rest, but leave the cup." She left it. She walked back through the 14 steps and the turn and the 7 more, back through the corridor where the cold air pushed through the crack in the third window, back through the palace that was still moving through its ordinary afternoon, as though nothing unusual had occurred. That evening, in her room, Senna untied the cloth pouch from her waist and opened it carefully. She reached inside and counted what remained, enough for perhaps 10 or 12 more cups. She sat with it in her hands for a long time. For 12 years, every time she had touched this pouch, it had been with a kind of grief she never allowed herself to name directly. It was the grief of someone who has lost so much that they begin to treat small things as if they are the last of something, because sometimes they are. The tea had been the last of her mother's voice, the last of the blue bowl, the last of the East Road and the winter mornings, and the sound of a village that no longer existed. But tonight, for the first time, the grief was slightly different. Not smaller, not healed, but different in the way that a wound is different once someone else has seen it. Still there, still real, but no longer entirely alone. She tied the pouch closed and set it beside her on the bed. In the study on the other side of the palace, the king sat in the same chair for a long time after the fire had gone low. The cold cup was still on the desk beside him. He did not call for anyone to take it away. He did not call for anyone at all. He sat, and he let himself think about Veyrath, the mill, the sound of the river, the name of his youngest sister, the way the morning light fell through the eastern trees in winter. He had not allowed himself to think about these things in so long that they arrived like water through a crack. Quietly at first, then more than he had expected. He had spent 16 years becoming someone else entirely. He had not expected to be found, not here, not like this, by someone who could not even see his face. Someone who had only needed to smell the air to know exactly where he came from, and exactly who he had been before the world remade him, into something grander and lonelier, and further from the East Road than he had ever meant to go. He looked at the cold cup of tea. He did not move it.